Hi, Rupin. How are you?
Hi, Kate. Nice to meet you. You're
It's
right.
nice. It's nice to meet you. I'm Dr. Kate Balestrieri, and thank you everyone who is watching us live today on YouTube. If you're listening on the podcast, please know we have all of our episodes on YouTube as well if you'd like to interact with us in video. Well, today we're talking about enmeshment and the effect of enmeshed parenting on the adult children's romantic and sex lives. And as you might know or intuitively understand, when you have a relationship with a parent that is too close, sometimes what can happen is the child's development really gets stunted in very different ways. But these can be confusing feelings because often, as an enmeshed child, it feels very privileged and exciting to be sort of super close with mom or dad. And as a clinician, I see the effects of this almost every day in my practice. And I'm so excited to have Rupin Rach with me today, the conscious parenting coach, so we can talk a little bit more about what enmeshment looks like, how to identify it if you're a parent or a child who's experienced it, and how to really understand the effects on your romantic and your sexual lives, and then make changes so that you can have a relationship with your family that feels liberated, that feels mutual, and that feels respectful of everyone's needs. So, Rupin, thanks so much again for joining me. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm really happy to be here today, Kate. So thanks very much for having me on. So my name's Rupin, and I'm a conscious parenting coach. And I've trained with Dr. Shifali over the last 6 months. And since graduating from her coaching institute, I've been helping parents to bring more conscious presence into their parenting relationships. And what that really means is to remove their anxieties and get a lot of their own conditioning from their own upbringing out of the way so that they can really start to parent the child that's actually in front of them. It's really important because we all have conditioning and we all have unconsciousness that we picked up from our families' backgrounds, which may go back generations, but we also have culture, religion,
Mm-hmm.
friends, just society in general that's kind of creating all these unconscious rules that we end up parenting our children from.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm really glad you brought that up because not only is there the risk for enmeshment in the parent child dyad, but we really, if we sort of take a bird's eye view, if and look at the way that society interacts with the parent and with the family system, from a macro perspective, there's a lot of enmeshment happening culturally and socially as well. So, this isn't necessarily just a conversation about parents and children, but more on how do we relate with each other in general and stay focused and present so that we can meet our individual needs, meet the needs of our own family systems, and create boundaries that set up everyone for mutual and loving, respectful parenting so that we can really, as you said, parent the child in front of us and not the child that we want or the child that we think we have or, so on.
Yeah, exactly. It's a really good point, actually, about the macro scale of it and how uh, I'm sure that there's some cultures which are a lot less involved, and
Mhm.
some sort of maybe governments and legislation that's less involved in parenting. But in the Western culture, we have a lot of involvement on the way that you're supposed to parent. There's a lot of education out there, and parents do want to be seen as good parents right now. It's
Mhm.
really important. Part of growing as a person is that you're also destined to become a parent and then a great parent.
Mm. Yes, for those people who do want to become a parent, it's really, I think, not only important for them to be seen as a good parent, but for them to be a good parent. And I don't know that I've come across many parents who have said, my goal is to be a terrible parent
No.
when I grow up. So I think I want to honor how challenging it can be for parents sometimes to know exactly what is the right thing to do for their family. And it's an interesting dichotomy and dilemma for many parents who are sort of torn between upholding the mythology and the rules and the ways of being that are both explicitly and implicitly passed along intergenerationally, and the loyalty that they have to their own families as they think about how to parent the children that they're bringing into the world. And that often brings up for them a big dilemma of, am I staying true to the ways that I was raised in and the ways of my parents and the things that they did? Because to deviate might mean to ruffle some feathers there, or to imply that it wasn't good enough parenting, right? There's a lot of fear around implying that how I was parented didn't work for so many reasons.
Definitely, yeah. It's almost like an insult, which is you're not allowed to say. You're not allowed to say like, "Oh, my mum messed me up. My dad, ruined my childhood."
Right.
It comes with the territory of actually being a good child. So that same struggle that we have to show up as a great parent is equally, it's challenging there as well to be a good child and to uphold the family name and to represent your family as a successful family, which actually is so such a massive part of enmeshment that everybody's sort of in on it, and everybody's trying to show the world how great and how successful we are as a family, whether it's the parents or the children. And it doesn't leave any room for the authentic and the downsides of life, of being a child, of being a parent, and being in a normal family. There's always going to be ups and downs. There's going to be good times and bad times, and there's always going to be judgment from everybody around, whether that's society, whether that's just the government and the country saying that that's not the way that you should parent your children, or perhaps it's their parents, the generation before, who are passing down judgment that you can't please everybody. There's always going to be some people that think that you're doing it wrong.
Right. Yeah, that's so important to note, because it really does create, and most of the time, an unconscious loyalty bind. And I'm not exactly sure who coined that term. I want to say it was Dr. Ken Adams, but if anyone listening knows otherwise, please drop it in the chat or the comments, or let me know, because I want to give credit where credit is due. But the term loyalty bind really is a term that speaks to this dilemma of being authentic to yourself, right? And potentially risking relationships with your authenticity, or staying loyal in your relationships and then having to disavow parts of yourself that may be really hard to let go of, or might feel like a big self-betrayal. And that dilemma gets passed down intergenerationally through family systems, through religion, through culture. There's a lot of mantra around, this is who we are. And if somebody deviates from that blueprint, then they might risk their inclusion in that group, whether it's their family, their culture, their religion. So this loyalty bind is a big dilemma that I think is a guiding compass for the way many parents approach their own parenting when they become parents, right?
Yeah, definitely. Like we just have to accept that we are human beings, and human beings are very social creatures that would much prefer to stay in the group. And if they're exiled from the group, that used to mean that you wouldn't survive if you were living in the forest and you had to leave the village by yourself because nobody accepted the way that you parented. Like, you probably wouldn't survive by yourself out there. So it's innate in us to want to remain acceptable to the group and to the masses. And so that same loyalty that resides within the family is going to be just as innate, that we actually don't want to betray the loyalty of our parents by saying that I have these challenges that I'm facing as an adult, and the reason why I'm facing these challenges is because of the way that I was raised. And so I think as as a culture at the moment, we're slowly starting to talk more and more about it. And I'm sure as a therapist, like you talk about that a lot within your community, but there's still so many people who would refuse to get therapy or would refuse to go to a coach, who just aren't ready to really have that conversation, that actually this might be something to do with what happened at home when you were younger.
Well, let's talk a little bit about defining enmeshment for folks who maybe aren't familiar with that phrase. So I'm curious, in your training, in your work, what do you see? How do you define it? What do you think about it?
Yeah, well, I think it's really useful to sort of like get a basic definition first off before we start talking about it too deeply, because when I was speaking to a few of my friends before I came on this talk, I realized that they actually don't know what the word means at all, and it's quite a new term to them. So I thought if I try and describe it to them, then maybe I'll be able to describe it with you quite effectively as well, and that the listeners will really start to understand. So I think that enmeshment really comes down to the intermingling between the parent and the child within the family unit, so that the parent has their emotional needs fulfilled through the child, and the child ends up abandoning their own needs in the moment, and so the child isn't able to live authentically and to be the child that they are, because the parent is suffering their own issues, and the parent is then seeking from the child some completion, some validation. And so the enmeshment starts with that emotional need and then ends up with the two of them, so the parent and the child, becoming intertwined and very importantly connected, and the relationship sort of becomes about maintaining the connection over a long period of time, so that the parent doesn't have to suffer the discomfort of not having those emotional needs met.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Can you hang on one second? I'm going to close my windows because a truck decided to grace us with its presence today. Hold on one second. Of course, the truck would evidence poor boundaries today and in time for this conversation. Yeah, I really love what you were saying. I mean, it really, enmeshment, the way I think about it, it changes the direction of attunement, right? Between a parent being attuned to the child and the child's needs, to instead co-opting the child's presence and making the child attuned to the parent's needs.
Right.
And that's where it really co-opts the development of the child, because instead of being able to focus on developing who they are and what they like and learning about the world through only their experience, they're asked to put their experience aside, indirectly, of course, and learn about the world through what mom or dad needs and how mom or dad sees the world, what mom or dad's fears are. And so they really learn to subjugate their own experience, and that can leave really long lasting effects on the development of their identity, on the way that they show up in relationships, and even the way in which they expect their bodies and their minds and their own experience to be valued in the world, right? Always in service of someone else's experience. And it's really insidious.
Yeah, the child is left not knowing that they are actually allowed to have their own experience, and not knowing that they're allowed to have their own space or have their own feelings, and is constantly on high alert to sort of try and guess where the parent might be coming from, and try to understand the parent's issues,
Right.
so that they can actually be there for the parent in the way that the parent is asking them to be.
Yeah.
However, the issues that the parent is suffering from, and the energy that the parent is trying to get back from that child, is a very adult concern, and it's a very
Yeah.
adult issue that the child is not capable of really dealing with, because the child's just a child and isn't ready for that kind of situation.
Yeah, that's such an important point to highlight. It creates this sort of elevated maturity and a false sense of maturity in a child that really bypasses all of their organic development, and it forces them to be so much more mature in a way that they're
Yeah.
not prepared for, because the parent, in seeking their emotional needs to be met in their child, um, really says to them, I think of you as an adult, so act like an adult. They create almost a surrogate friendship or a surrogate partnership in the relationship they have with their child.
Yeah, exactly. It's way too early for that child to be engaging in
Mm-hmm.
those ways. And while we're talking about it, we're kind of talking about it in a very technical sort of like the factual ways that
Mm-hmm.
it shows up. But really, it could be something very, very simple and sort of like difficult to detect in the way
Mm-hmm.
that the parent is interacting with the child.
What's an example that you can think of?
Yeah, so like I was thinking back to some of my clients who I coach about the way that they're attuning to their children, and like sometimes it can be something like the child sleeps with in the parent's bed at an age which is quite far beyond when that's appropriate,
Mm-hmm.
and it might have been first because of a bad dream or a nightmare or something like that. But then the next night, it wasn't about a nightmare. It was because the parent really enjoyed having somebody there and having that
Mm-hmm.
closeness and having that connection that they may have missed from from when they had a little baby, and they miss those
Mm-hmm.
good old days. Now they've got a 7-year-old who sort of like doesn't really pay that much attention to them, but at
Mm-hmm.
nighttime they sleep together. So that's one sort of really useful example to
Mm-hmm.
paint a picture of what enmeshment can start to look like. Another one would be that if there's an argument that's happening between the parents, that as
Mm-hmm.
soon as the argument's finished, the person who then the parent who's upset goes to find recovery and to feel
Mm.
better is the child, and they approach the child um, with the intention of having somebody to talk to, or the
Yes.
intention of having somebody that makes them feel better.
Hmm. That is one of the most common scenarios that I hear about, that one of the children in the family ended up being mom or dad's therapist, mom or dad's parent, if you will.
Yeah,
They were always leaned on to be the voice of reason, the voice of comfort, and they often feel very put in the middle of their parents because of that inadvertent triangulation, right? A parent seeking comfort in their child really, creates in them a tension between the child and the other parent, because they
yeah,
are trying to soothe one parent's feelings, and unconsciously they're sort of being asked to take sides and create an allegiance there, and a loyalty that can create a lot of distance between the child and the other parent, which ends up then really kind of chopping up the family system and creating almost a new pair bond between the parent and the child who are enmeshed, and the parent who's on the outs.
yeah, absolutely. It's just not the right place to go to get your therapist,
Right.
and that's a massive issue, is that you're basically telling the child that the other parent is wrong in that scenario, and the adult issues which you're arguing about are far more complex than just
Mm,
I'm right and they're wrong.
right.
And then the second part to that to be aware of is that this child that you're talking to, if it's sort of like a biological child from both of the parents, you're actually complaining about 50% of that child, and saying that there's a part of you that I don't
Yes.
appreciate, and there's a part of you that I can't accept.
Right, right. That can be really, really damaging when that child grows up and starts to go into the dating world, because if they exhibit characteristics of the other parent, either physically or behaviorally or in the way that they think or approach relationships,
Yeah.
it might create such a paradigm of shame and fear that inhibits their ability to be a partner in a way that might feel really organic for them, because they remember in the back of their mind the way in which the other parent was so hurt by that
Yes.
behavior or by that preference or by uh, that expression on their parent's face. And so they'll really work hard, again, usually unconsciously, to tamp down anything about themselves that doesn't fit the mold of the person that their enmeshed parent needed in order to feel okay.
Mm. Yeah, and there'll be massive parts of their emotional repertoire that they are just hiding from, and that
Yes.
they absolutely won't go near. And I would say, like, anger is a pretty good example of that. we could
Yes.
we could use the example of anger. Perhaps there was a fight between mum and dad, and the dad got angry, and the child heard the anger or saw the violence happening, and then the mum came to the child and said, "Oh, dad's got angry again. This situation's happened." And then in the adult relationships of the child, anger is actually a very useful emotion
I
to be
agree.
able to harness and to
Mm-hmm.
use as a constructive tool to create connection and to communicate your needs. And if it's off limits, if it's just
Mm-hmm.
like one of those emotions that I don't go to because I saw what it did and I saw
Mm.
the damage that it did when I was younger, then you're likely to have a lot of issues in that romantic
Right.
relationship.
Right, right. And what ends up happening is people will then enmeshed, excuse me, people who had enmeshed parents often find themselves seeking out partners whose emotional needs mirror that of their enmeshed parent,
Yeah,
right? And they repeat that pattern because that's what all of us do, right? We find what's familiar
yeah,
until we're conscious about what we want and make different conscious decisions. But in those dynamics, they are often entering into a relationship because they feel obligated to, or they feel like it's their duty to show up with this partner. They don't want to disappoint the partner. They don't want to be responsible for the partner's pain or sadness, disappointment, or anything like that. So, what ends up happening often is somebody sort of shuts down in that relationship, likely because it's difficult to process the anger and the resentment that come with not being able to be your authentic self and speak truthfully about what you want, what you need, who you are, and to feel accepted. So instead, they sort of act out of the relationship. They'll show up in this kind of duty bound way inside the relationship, and then they're more authentic outside the relationship, which is where there can often be a bifurcation of sex and love, right? If you have a parent who was too emotionally close and didn't have healthy, appropriate emotional boundaries with you, it might not feel safe and comfortable for you to be integrative with your emotional intimacy and your sexual intimacy. So, people who grew up with enmeshed parents might find themselves feeling more disconnected sexually with their partner and only able to be more sexually vital in areas where there aren't a lot of emotional demands on them.
mm, yeah, definitely. I think that what you mentioned there about sort of seeking out the repeat of the pattern
Hmm.
from the household that you grew up in, and then repeating it in your romantic relationship is exactly the problem that adult children who grew up in enmeshed families suffer from.
Hmm.
And it is unconscious. It's like, for some reason, you're drawn to this person. You don't know why. Things might not actually be that healthy. Things might not be that sort of like happy, or you're not really in the honeymoon phase of the relationship, but something's drawing you in and keeping you there. And
Mm.
it's the part of you that might feel like, if only my parents had been as good as me, if only my parents had worked as hard as I do for the relationship, then things would have worked out then. And so the unconsciousness within us tries to fix the problems and tries to do it one step better than what we saw when we were younger. And sort of taking those lessons that we've learned. And it's really interesting how it's almost like a very familiar person, like that it's very common that the person will be really, really similar to the enmeshed parent, and the adult child won't really recognize the similarities, not always. And sometimes they will, but sometimes they will be doing it totally blind to how, everybody outside the relationship can see, like, you're very close with your parents, and now you've picked a partner that exactly resembles them. And it might be visually, like they might look exactly like them, but they also will emotionally resemble them. And when we do the conscious parenting work or the reparenting work, what we're really trying to do is understand the emotional pattern that you felt when you were younger, and how you're trying to repeat the emotional pattern so that you're feeling the same way as you did when you were younger. And as much as we want to sort of like heal out of that and to change from trying to repeat our patterns, actually, like, just observing it and recognizing that this is a really natural phenomenon, and that lots of people do go into relationships that repeat the patterns, is part of the healing process. It's like observing it's useful.
Absolutely. I mean, everyone seeks out what is familiar to them unconsciously when they're looking for an adult pattern, because when we're younger, our brain and the entire neurobiological system in our body encodes certain kinds of behaviors with the experience of being cared for and being loved and getting some of your needs met. So whether or not consciously we think, wow, I had really great parents, or I didn't, we seek out elements of that dynamic because it's familiar, and it's what our body recognizes as familiar. And so even if it's not consciously what we've decided is healthy for us, we find ourselves going into those patterns automatically, because as a default, our body goes, oh, I know this. Right? I know how to recognize this. This feels right, or it feels comfortable, like it's home. And that pull is part of our desire to maybe have a different outcome. So we can repeat that same pattern with multiple partners until we become conscious of what is, what is part of that earlier dynamic. And then we can start to make changes and set different boundaries and take time to really harvest a relationship with ourselves, which is one of the biggest steps, in my opinion, of healing from enmeshed parenting, is really creating a very individuated path and a committed relationship with yourself.
Yeah. And the pattern being repeated, what I try and get my clients to see is that the common denominator in that pattern is you, and that you're the one that keeps ending up in those relationships, and that although this time that they've got brown hair and last time they had blonde hair, it's like it's the emotional pattern that keeps getting repeated until you realize that you're the common denominator, and that you are the one who's attracting that into your life. And that's really sort of like I guess the first step before I would take my clients to having that emotional relationship with themselves and that intimacy with themselves. But I would definitely agree that, and even just for myself, getting to know my own emotional experience and my own authenticity, and perhaps even my own intimacy, has been really useful to start to break free of any issues that may have been plaguing me in the past, and patterns repeated from my own life. And so I can really relate to that.
Yeah. I mean, it's really curious how insidious the effects of enmeshment are on people's development and their identity and their relationships. And it can show up in even really subtle ways, like not knowing what kind of eggs you like, right? It's really interesting. And
Yeah.
there was a movie many years ago, Runaway Bride, and I really feel like it's such a great depiction of the effects of enmeshment on somebody's life, because in the movie, Julia Roberts' character was set to marry, I think, 4 or 5 different people. And as she gets to the altar, she runs, right? So hence the name Runaway Bride. But the reporter who's doing the story on her asks each one of her partners, what kind of eggs did she like? And lo and behold, they each said whatever kind of eggs they liked. So
Yeah.
one was poached, one was scrambled, one was sunny side up,
Yeah.
or so on. And it really speaks, I think, and illustrates how subtly somebody's identity can be co-opted. So part of her healing was to learn what kind of eggs did she really like. And it's
Mm,
little things like that that can help create individuation, which then give people an opportunity to be more authentic in their relationships. Because when you have an enmeshed parent, it really feels like you can't explore your own experience. Everything is in service of them. So I find people really show up in the mold that they think is expected of them, and they
right.
don't really know who they are or what they want on some core level.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's funny how like enmeshment actually shows up in so many films and
Mm.
a lot of pop culture. I think it's a really common theme, and I wonder if there is a reason for that, and perhaps like people that go into the media industry are trying to express themselves finally in the media that they're allowed to, and
Mm.
the individuation, like you said, is like if you have never been allowed to have your own decisions, to be your own person, to even consider yourself as a whole individual person where like
Mhm.
you're separate from the people around you, then when you're sort of like just thrust out into the world and you're like left to be an adult by yourself, you are going to try and find something or somebody that will guide you and that will tell you like,
Mhm.
oh, this is good and this is what you need to know and this is
Right.
what you like, and that can leave you very vulnerable. I think that's um one of the really sort of like my big fears with a lot of my clients is when we start to do the work and when we start to escape the shackles of their enmeshment, is that actually you're at a really vulnerable place where you're just open now and you're sort of like in the chaos of the
Mhm.
unknown, and now you have to be okay with not knowing because this is the first time that you've been allowed to sit and
Yeah.
take the time and decide and actually find out like what is it that draws you, and who really are you.
Mhm. That's great. Well, what are some things that you might share with parents who are struggling to maybe understand how to interrupt this pattern of enmeshment if they recognize it in their own style of parenting?
Hmm. So are you asking if it's a parent and they maybe are enmeshed with their child?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, well, my big like strong theory here is that this is all about an unmet need within the
Mm.
parent.
Right.
So my stance is always to come from empathy and compassion, and we really need to
Mhm.
try and understand what it is that the parent is trying to achieve by acting in these ways, because they don't know that there's a definition in enmeshment. They don't even think of it as like a big theme in the way that they're parenting. They just think like, oh, that one time that I sort of like made the decision for them, and that, you know, that other
Mhm.
time that they wanted to dye their hair blue but I said no, and like all those things that they think are um good parenting and just one-offs, but really this is kind of like, this is forking the child's development into the child who the parent needs them to be. And
Yeah.
so really just trying to understand where the parent has their own unmet needs from their own childhood. That's where we always start, but we
Mhm.
don't really like dwell there for too long, because actually the child in front of us needs the change right now. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's very urgent that, and any parent that's causing and inflicting unconsciousness onto their child does the work immediately, and at least puts into place the better and the more healthier connections, so that the child can flourish
Mm-hmm.
from like straight away.
Yeah.
So
I,
what I would
Go ahead.
oh sorry and so so what I would it like what I would look for is, I would look for if the parent had perhaps their own enmeshment when they were
Mm-hmm.
younger with one of their own parents, and perhaps the parent has had their own emotional needs not met. Perhaps like they might have had a bit of a narcissistic parent who was
Mm-hmm.
unable to see them for who they were,
Mm-hmm.
who perhaps severed themselves from their own authenticity, and created that deep inner wound from an
Mm-hmm.
early age. And then uh, perhaps looking at the current emotional fulfillment from the romantic relationship of the parent
Yeah.
in today's age.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you're saying there around having empathy and really bringing compassion to that conversation. Because, as I said earlier, this is not something that parents wake up and say, wow, I really want to be enmeshed with my child. I really want to co opt my child's identity and their development. And I really want my child to take care of me. That's not a conscious thing that I've really heard many, if any, parents articulate. That the enmeshment comes from very, very deep wounds and unmet needs, and that's so spot on. So I think, I agree with everything you said. Really helping the parents to understand what are their needs and finding different real-time practical ways of getting those needs met is essential in interrupting this pattern and this process. Because when you start to help a parent develop more community, right, where they can have mutual relationships with same aged peers or
Yeah,
appropriately aged peers, um, it takes the pressure then off of their child to be their friend and off of their child to be their therapist. So, really kind of broadening their community, I think, is one big step. And just as you said, really looking at, if they are in a partnered relationship, what's the quality of that relationship? How are those two as a pair in their coupleship really relating to each other? Is there some resentment there? Are there some poor communication patterns that would benefit from having a look and a little refresh around? How can we get those parents to be each other's partner again, so that the child isn't being implicitly asked to step into that role? I
yeah,
think is so key.
yeah, yeah. One of the ways that is really useful. I would like to say that obviously the journey is individual, and every
Mm,
single one of my clients, they need something completely different,
yeah.
because this is about their own authentic experience as well. And so when they get to come to the sessions, they get to be the fullest version of themselves, and they get to show all of their emotions, and they get to be complete. And I do try and create that emotional container for them within the session, so that they can finally express themselves. Because sometimes the parents, they just they've never known what it felt like
Yeah.
to be authentic, and
Right.
the child is forcing them by um, opposing their
Hmm.
sort of rigid rules, that and the manipulation that comes with the enmeshment. The child is saying, no, like, I'm not willing to put up with this. Like, you need to sort of like fill your own cup somewhere
Hmm.
else. And
Hmm.
so it, like, one of the useful things that I often get the parents to do is to go and spend time with the child on the child's level, and sort of like
Hmm.
teach them just how to reframe that situation. And instead of dragging the child to whatever it is that they think that the child is going to want to do, or
Hmm.
perhaps like scheduling the child's time out in the way that the parent thinks is the best way, just to reframe those things, and give the child a bit more autonomy, and to say,
Hmm.
well, perhaps like, would it be okay if as a parent you went and sat on the sofa next to the child whilst they play PlayStation, or perhaps like go and, let them cook,
Yeah.
let them cook once a week or something, and be more with them.
Yeah. With them, with their experience, right? Asking questions about how they see the world, how they perceive things, what are their
Yeah,
likes, their interests, and learning about their inner experience
yeah,
is a really nice practical way of kind of reversing this enmeshment, because again, enmeshment is really an absence of boundaries and an assumption of sameness or oneness in terms of the psychological goals of the parent. Again, that's all
yeah,
unconscious and implicit. So taking an active effort to really learn about, how does my child see the world? What is my child feeling right now? Can I create a context where I can hold space for their separate experience from mine
yeah,
and attune to both? That's
yes.
really, I think a nice way to kind of start getting out of that pattern.
Absolutely. It's so hard to do in
Yeah.
practice. Like, to actually let somebody else just guide their own journey through life, when
Yeah.
you know that if they do that, that's going to end badly. Like, that's what the parent's going through. They literally know better because they've done it all before. They have their own anxieties that are sort of like thinking out every single possibility of what might go wrong or what might go well. And so the parent normally will be very well informed about, what decision the child should make on their life. And so their lack of boundaries, or the one-way boundaries, is probably one of the ways that I like to think about it, is that the parent will be imposing these one-way boundaries where there's no
Mm-hmm.
negotiation,
Mm-hmm.
coming from love, coming from the position like, I want the best for my child, and I actually care about them.
Of course.
Yeah, but there's this like really beautiful unknown that we don't know what happens when you just allow the child to grow and to flourish into who they really are going to be.
Mm-hmm.
um, it's it might not be as good as what your projections were or what you hoped for in your metrics, but it will be exactly who they were supposed to be.
I love that you just said that, based on your metrics. And that really is the hallmark of enmeshment, right? There's a foreclosure on who this child is supposed to be because of what the parent wants for the child. And it's not to say that you can't have hopes that your child is successful, or hopes that your child is happy, and really create a framework for that. But where it stops being, I think, effective scaffolding for children and starts being enmeshment is when there's a rigid expectation of who your child is supposed to be, and that rigidity comes from a need that is unmet in you, right? So
Yeah,
many parents do this where they didn't get to live the life that they wanted to, so they try to curate a path for their child to live it out instead. But the child really doesn't want to ride horses, or they don't want to go to dance school, or they don't want to be an accountant. But the parent says, no, this is the best, and I didn't get it, so you should have it. And it really is rooted in such good intentions, but also such trauma usually.
yes. Well, like in consciousness we call it ego, that you're
Mm,
parenting from a place of ego, that
mm,
as a parent your ego will be fulfilled, and
mhm.
you will meet the needs of your own ego if your child does the horse riding. And then you can, like, it's really easy to put into the context of, then you can go tell your mates that your child does horse riding, or you can go and tell your mates that your child got all A stars, or
Mm.
that your child is grade 7 on piano, and all of these things that are actually to self promote the
Yes.
parents.
Yeah. Well, this has been such an insightful conversation, and I'm so grateful for you for taking some time to talk with me about enmeshment. Where can people learn more about you if they'd like to work with you and get a better sense of how they can interrupt their own patterns?
Oh yeah, sure. So that'd be great. yeah, well, I think Instagram is a really useful place to reach out to me at the moment. So my Instagram handle is Rupin Rach, that's RUPINRACH. And I do have a website that's just in the final touches right now, so it should be live really soon. And I have a booking link which is available in my Instagram bio, and I think you've got the booking link as well.
I do, and I'll make sure to put all of your information in the show notes. So anybody who's listening to this or watching it on YouTube, please check out our website, modernintimacy.com/podcast, and you can find this interview with Rupin and all of his information there. And for any adult children of enmeshment who are looking to really understand the effects on them more in depth, I am co-hosting a workshop on July 16th from 9 to 11 a.m. Pacific time that will go through all the domains of life and how people can really recognize the long-term effects of enmeshment and help them create a very practical strategy for addressing this with their parents or on their own to make sure that they can have a more integrated, authentic, and holistic life. So feel free to shoot an email to info@modernintimacy.com if that's something you might be interested in. All right, everyone, thanks so much. We'll see you next time.